Здравствуйте. Очень приятно вас видеть. Сегодня обе лекции будут по-английски, потому что наши гости не говорят по-русски. Поэтому я говорю на английский тоже сейчас. I wanted to just mention a few words about Time Bank. It's a project that we started in New York with Julieta Aranda about 3 years ago. We opened the first branch in New York and tried to open a restaurant there last September for an exhibition which was called Living as Form. It was actually quite a lot of work because in New York we did not have a kitchen, so we had to cook in one location and then transport gigantic amounts of food quite far away, so it was absolutely exhausting, but for me it was maybe the most satisfying art project I've ever done, because there is something extremely gratifying about feeding people, or, you know, even if the food is not the best one you ever made, just the idea that you actually satisfied somebody's hunger for an afternoon makes you feel quite satisfied, you know, and it's immediate, unlike art, when you sometimes have to wait decades for the effect of your work. Yeah, with food, it happens instantaneously at the end of the dinner. So before I pass the microphone to Katja, who will introduce the discursive part of the program, I also wanted maybe Ingrid to say a couple of words. Ingrid is an artist and a curator from Norway, from Bergen. She works at Bergen Kunsthall, which is kind of a fantastic art institution, where she is also a chef, or has been a chef of the restaurant, which is called Landmark. And she very kindly agreed to come to Moscow for a couple of weeks and help us run our little temporary restaurant. So here's Ingrid, and thank you so much for today.
So I didn't cook alone. I had two wonderful helpers hiding behind the wall over there. Today we cooked a menu that wasn't mine. It was Cabinet Magazine sent in some recipes that we cooked. I wasn't there. They cooked it themselves in New York, and now we're sort of remaking it here. Oh. So this is what we've done. We've like asked artists and to come and cook with us, or we've cooked their recipes. Some of the recipes are our own. A lot of the time Anton would cook Russian food, I would cook Norwegian food, and Julieta would do Mexican. So it has a tendency to be about nationalities when it comes to food sometimes. I don't know exactly what to say.
The menu for tomorrow.
Oh, the menu for tomorrow is, now I'm cooking Moroccan food. So it's going to be harissa soup, and everything is going to be vegetarian, a lot of spices, and if I can get them, I'm going to get some help with that. So that's the menu for tomorrow. Yeah.
Fantastic. So maybe now we'll pass it to...
So I'll also say a couple of words. Actually, Ingrid, I didn't know that you're from Bergen. That's great. It makes it even more meaningful for me, as you know, since I'm doing a project in Bergen. About the project in general, I liked it very much, this combination of art and food. I've been recently to China, and the leading Chinese art critic and curator was talking about contemporary art, how useful it has to be, and he put it this way. He said that art has to be nutritious, and he meant it literally. So he was talking about agriculture, and he really thinks that art has to be nutritious, and I thought at that point this is a little Chinese way to put things. But then I returned back to Moscow, and accidentally I reread a famous text by Leo Tolstoy, What is Art? Что такое искусство? And in this text, as you might remember, he criticizes contemporary art very strongly and writes that the artists and theater directors and musicians, for that matter, are feeding people with something very bad and which is impossible to digest. So he's also using this metaphor of art, that art has to be nutritious, and I find it's a very beautiful metaphor of the contemporary way of thinking, which is happening here. So at the same time, our event also, as you know, has a topic, and this topic, art and resurrection, I think also can be understood in this way. Resurrection is actually very nutritious, as we might already have felt during last weeks in Moscow. It really feeds our minds and our bodies and our general attitude to life, which becomes much more meaningful than, let's say, a year ago. So we hope we'll have an interesting discussion on art and politics, art and insurrection, and how important, useful, and nutritious it can be. So I'm very proud and glad to introduce our first speaker, which is Sara Rifki, for who is her very first time in Moscow. Sara, her most recent thing she's doing, she's an agent for Documenta 13, which means that Documenta 13 this year, which is opening very soon, has several people who have a status of special contributors to the project, and Sara is one of them. Besides that, she's a curator and writer based in Cairo, in Egypt, where she was born. She's the co-founder of Beirut. She directs Cairo International Resource Center for Art and is curator of Town House. She has lots of institutions. She also co-directs the Mass Alexandria Independent Studio and study program. She used to live in Malmö, Sweden, where she studied. She is also co-editor of the Reloading Images book, Damascus Tourist Artists' Secret Agents. And she's writing a lot, including in Bidun, Moose, Flash Art, Spike Art Quarterly, Art Agenda, and Egypt Independent. So I'm giving the word to Sara.
Thank you for the lovely introduction. Привет, я Сара, я куратор. Сегодня я буду говорить по-английски. I would like to start, of course, by thanking everybody involved who has made it possible for me to come here, including Time Bank, Stella Art Foundation, Katya, Anton, and Nikolai. Today I have been specifically asked to share with you a text that has not been published, entitled The Going Insurrection. But before, sort of to contextualize how I've been thinking how this may relate to my being here, both in Moscow right now, but also within this context of time food, there are very sort of obvious starting points. The very first word that was uttered in Cairo in January 2011 in relation to sort of the strife for freedom was bread. So it related to food. So it starts with عيش حرية عدالة اجتماعية, which is bread, freedom, and social justice. The other starting point, and also of which I've chosen the excerpt to include in the abstracts, which some of you have, is an incident that is real and that started perhaps this entire text. And it was a moment at which we were in a kitchen with several friends, journalists, filmmakers, and photographers. And it was at that particular moment, seeing many people who work with images and moving images, and also trying to configure their practice from what they do as work to something else, namely to cook for insurgents in the square. I started thinking about this uncanny relationship of food, survival, politics, but also in relation to image making. And what ends up being documented oftentimes is not what happens in the kitchen, but what happens elsewhere. So with that, I would like to share with you this reading, much of which is a direct account and a reflection that was written over several months in relation to the last year. I hope you bear with me. What should I do? What should I do? We anticipated atrocities, mayhem, and chaos. All there was a strange stillness lingering over violence from the night before. It doesn't matter where or when this was. There are many nights. The calmness was sincere, not eerie or strange, as one might imagine. Blood shed in peace startles. It felt welcoming enough to want to be there amidst everyone, amidst you. We walked between people, tents, clusters of conversations, gave out newspapers, shared news, scenarios, and oranges we had bought. 9 floors up, in a balcony overlooking freedom, journalists propped their cameras for an uninterrupted airing of a live aerial view of protesters. On television, it looked like an image forever. It was a crime to switch it off, unless you became part of the image. In the kitchen, filmmakers and photographers made soup in large pots, lentil soup. They took turns checking on the brewing vegetables inside and adjusting their viewfinders from the balcony, looking down outside. 9 stories down, a man paced up and down, reading the newspaper through a megaphone. Standing next to him was liberating. Everything felt slow, very, very different from real time. Days passed, people walking and circling, let's call it the situation. Deliberating the scenography and living on set. A situation staging itself. Protesters seemed to take cues from photographs. They stood frozen like figures holding up placards, jokes, self-fashioned illustrations. Totally frozen. They held their poses for each other to take pictures, like pictures, of pictures, for pictures. A man on a lamppost would not descend until the president abdicated, until he stepped down. He is still there. It is a performance still, an image endlessly reproduced. And I have thought many, many times how to picture it. If I tell you of it now, if I read it to you now, have you seen it? I saw it and saw it 100 times again on screen. My memory is confused between the lived and the mediated experience. I don't feel slowness. I am desensitized to the slowness, to hovering in this timeless set, like now. Sometimes the set is a set of images, a set of posters, a set of placards. Sometimes it's a set of ideals. What should I do? I ask a photographer, a friend. She says, document. I look around me and all I see is phones, your phones, shooting phones, phones shooting other phones, posters framing other posters, and thousands, millions of people asking themselves the same question, like I did, like you did. What should I do? Cameras from every angle. Every hand is a phone. And every phone is an archiving device. Every device is a screen. All screens are recursive. Entangled cables of news. This is self-fashioned auto-documentary action. It exceeds media. So I write a letter. Dear Invisible Committee, the insurrection came, but it was confused with spectacle. I think I am partially to blame for the current human condition. I am depressed. What should I do? Sincerely, Sara. I get a letter back, surprisingly. Dear, you are not depressed. You are on strike. For those of us who refuse to manage themselves, depression is not a state, but a passage. A bowing out, a sidestep towards political disaffiliation. Medication and the police are the only possible form of conciliation. Sincerely, the Invisible Committee. Signed. Documenting is no longer a delayed action, or an action of transmitting the event with some delay to a wider public. Documenting has become an integral part of the event. I will not write letters. I will not be depressed. I will document. I will tell stories. One time, I took out my pen and notebook. Like an ethnomusicologist in the field of resistance, I made notations of a song in a square. That very instant, and that is a true story, I'm not making it up, a stranger's hand slipped into my pocket and made its way into the crowds with my phone. This was a gentle lesson from a thief telling me at times one must not write. Do something. There was a night in February, almost a year back now, I decided to write. I decided to write because I was sleepless, helpless, frustrated. I hate writing, but sometimes I feel better having written. I reasoned that writing, any writing, is a divided act. It demands separating oneself from what is happening, and somehow affording oneself this privilege doesn't always seem so right. When I told that to a news editor and activist, she said, well, for her, writing was somehow different. Writing is activism. So I signed up to serve as a journalist for her newspaper. I spent hours with words, but I never actually delivered any copy. None whatsoever. The news is constantly changing, I said. I cannot report flux. I cannot report on things that are constantly changing. I told that to her. And I tried to sort of take her words of writing is activism as a starting point. But I still struggle of how to think of writing and reading instrumentally. Could I forcibly bend my words into some kind of weapon, say, or something that could really do something? So I continue to try and fail, perhaps better all the time. But words really have a will of their own. There is no contraceptive for writing. I cannot control what words bear to mean. Writing is thinking with words about things. I am happy to sit with unstable thoughts in the privacy of my own pages. And the instant words know they're about to meet their listeners or their readers, they start getting dressed in familiar characters. They sound stylistically anachronistic, and if you have a little boy, you might know this. They would behave like little boys dressed in their mother's high heels. Or if you are a little boy, you would know this. Don't write. The writer is not an insurgent. The sentence just said, writers are not insurgents. But listen carefully. Those wrapped in blankets, sleeping in the tracks of army tanks, so the tanks don't close in on protesters, don't write. Those who fling themselves towards the shields of policemen curbing demonstrations, those who prepare Molotov cocktails, those who dodge, pick up, and fling back tear gas canisters, don't write. Soccer ultra fans, don't write. They don't even speak to those who do write. Writing and insurrection are not concurrent. They're not compatible. Writing loves insurrection. It tries to give it something that it cannot experience itself. Insurrection doesn't want it. This is the classic scenario of love. The insurrection will come and go with or without writing. So what is this writing and why are we here, I wonder? This is entertainment. Writing about insurgents, cowboys and thugs on camelback, waving words, swords, after the event, imagined or real, is fiction. We write it because it helps us approach an understanding of the world with the aid of narrative. Naming a curious incident, whatever that incident is, allows it to be less strange. It contains it, in a word, a little box labeled, let's call it curious incidents. When I read news reports about current events, I often wonder if there is a cache of feeling, a daily quote of empathy that, if used up too quickly, leaves us devoid of feeling for days to come. Reading the news will drain you of your empathy. Writing, however, is restorative. There are more texts being written than there ever has been before, and finally, more than ever will be read. Writers, though, are not the diary keepers of uprisings, and even the best writing, don't forget, is completely corrupt. It steals time from other things, if you come to think about it, like, as I said, making soup with filmmakers. I think it is hard to switch between chopping up words, stirring broth, and preparing cocktails, particularly Molotovs. Writing is a figurative experience of thought. It is a coping mechanism. In between writing, we might serve big words like freedom, like bread, like social justice, with small actions, like printing slogans, distributing supplies, bookkeeping debts. These are cliches, essentially. So, cliches reproducing cliches. When one leaves one's house, office, desk, and enters into a field of open possibility, a street for days riddled with live and rubber bullets, firing, trapped in clouds of toxins, masked from tear gas, does one approach death happily, open-chested, welcoming? I don't know. And I would like to imagine that one hopes to live. This hope is necessary. If it becomes ever acceptable, do remember that, to think that everyone leaving their home, assuming their right to protest, is willing to die, then we risk devaluating life. It means all what is being done in vain. In speaking, in writing, some might say we want to be martyrs. We don't fear death. Remember, a martyr does not want to be a martyr. Language is romantic. Quoting the deceased's last words, and we have lost friends, stenciling faces into icons, and we have seen them on stickers, fashioning names into symbols, reframe death into a force of life. And expression is, in a way, a blanket that we sleep with while we keep fear in a shoebox outside of dreams. And it is tiring, as you can imagine, to write about things like hope, like love, like death, because in running, one tires, and wearing the wrong shoes, the risk of tripping face first into cliches is inevitable. So when I told a friend who writes, not a photographer this time, I don't know what to do, she said, and she meant it, it is because this moment demands of us to be literal and sincere. And we are so used to being cynical and figurative about everything. Most people don't get that. Even we don't get it when we think of it, this thing about being sincere. Without an atlas or agenda, Love, writing, reading, and hope all have something in common. They all rely and focus on a little mind trick. Work with me. You set aside your pragmatic, rationalizing thoughts, and in their place, you let something grow. So there's this leap of faith suspending reality that requires a degree of practice. It requires a degree of believing in something called fiction. To love is to hope, is to open oneself to the risk of the incalculable. To imagine the outcome of hope, love, action, writing, meaning through reading, is to assert definition or defeat. Allowing oneself to swim in one's own, or even better, in someone else's thoughts, somebody that is sitting right across from you or next to you. Letting go and giving in to disorientation is necessary to examine one's values, to walk aimlessly and to sleep deeply and to sink in one's dreams and remember them, to love without protection, to be loved unprotected, to take action without a plan, to find hope without an atlas, to submit to it without agenda, to improvise, to not determine or formulate. Making time for these things is really difficult. And even when one makes the time, one needs to devise certain mind tricks and practice them. To think, not thinking. To write, not writing. To act, not acting. To read, not reading. To document, not documenting. If your mind trick, whatever it is, becomes undone, you will fall. Imagine a dream in which you are floating in salt water. If you think yourself into awakening or think of the depth beneath you, you will plummet and you will sink. And the feeling of lightness floating, the possibilities of where you will go if you don't cling on to knowing, will completely dissipate and get lost into waking. So the dream will become undone. And you will tell yourself you were dreaming and that is the end of it. Writing as thinking through hope risks coming too close to thinking, and thinking tends to gravitate to what we already know. And there is something else that needs to happen, and for that to really take place, the free fall is absolutely crucial. Being out of control, slipping into dreams, singing in sleep, dancing in talk, and writing in love. As we said, imply love in writing. This is another story. We were somewhere in the Baltic because cities got confused and scents of Soviet oranges linger in memory, which is nothing more than imagination. And memory is nothing more than imagination backwards. We are surrounded by music that grew on trees in the early 90s with roots and bass. We were all pretty trashed, tipping on the verge of boredom into euphoria. Some fall in love and others are just high. It is all temporary. Taxis don't come, dealers do. Heads float high with free spirits. Outside, our feet firmly grow deeper into the ground, and we wrap ourselves around each other with a buzz of slow acceleration, and we move on. Across an array of languages in the back seats of cars, behind windshields, we end up in some club. We are ushered in, past sweat-laden dancing bodies, up a staircase narrow and winding. It feels like 9 floors. Standing at the top, we look down. A familiar image, a hologram of dance arenas, public squares. I'm with a friend. Mecca, soccer stadiums. And how did we really end up here, and what are we really talking about? There is a missing V effect, paranoia, friends, idols, heroes, style. Attitude, details melt into a fatigued mass. We all hold hands, trying to build scaffoldings for trust. You know how it is on drugs. Trust is a red bathroom without cards, blades, or keys, or anything that will divide lines. On the backseat of a toilet, we share democracy. Elated in glamour or humor, we push each other. Claiming one's time to take time, experiencing something for the first time, I'm told bodes well for our dream of becoming good mothers. A surge of thoughts on a politics inspired by bodies, soccer ultra fans, in irreverence of fear, of death, on reading violence, in climax, a new world is possible. Interlocking accents we embrace, violating syntax. We break down order in love, making writing, we dream, a new state is possible. This is not a revolution. The next morning after this party, I spent an hour in the bathroom, and I realized I was pregnant. I was pregnant with another time's ideas. In the morgue, this is a different story. An activist friend of mine approaches death quite pragmatically, or tries to. She will enter the morgue, count the dead, document terror, and ensure medical reports state accurate facts about the causes of death. She will talk to the families of the deceased and prepare meticulous accounts on the losses of life. No matter how detailed the account, when she tells me about her work, I can only imagine her. I relate to her experience, I imagine what she goes through, a mediated experience of what she is trying to experience herself. When she talks, I pick up on her bodily cues. I feel similar, though not the same as she might have felt. When she is in the morgue, she's trying to feel like the bullet-ridden bodies covered in sheets, she says, but she can't, because she's pregnant. It is tedious. There are moments when action is only manifest in reaction. There is more time spent replaying events in which one has already been present as a body than ever before. Here comes another story. So recently, 4 musicians I know had just finished a street performance, and we gathered at their house afterwards. Minutes later, a friend plugged his camera into a laptop, and for the next half hour, we all sat down there again in the apartment, replaying this event that we had all just watched. It's kind of a little bit like reliving things, the repetitions of sequences, or like learning to memorize poetry at school. You repeat the lines over and over again and reread them and remember them and recall them. And this is what we do with the news. It's tedious, but somehow it is exercise for one's brain against the risk of forgetting. And repetition, one could think, is also a form of meditation, so it's spiritual, with the aspiration of getting closer to some kind of center of meaning. We meet and tell ourselves of these experiences of watching and rewatching, telling and retelling. And reproduction is a part of production, we always say. Rewriting is tedious because as you rewrite, you rethink, and as you read, you reread everything you have thought while you are still thinking it, and time is taught as tense, and finally you can't really think anymore or listen. To realize something. There is a risk of speaking about these things, like art, like insurrection, and representing them too quickly as they happen. It incites thoughts, and thinking too much, as we said, betrays the event. So last week I heard someone saying, it was actually more than a week ago, a couple of months ago, I heard someone saying that one cannot realize a project worth thinking of. His words resonate with something what we could call project revolution. Thinking steals time from insurgent action, as writing or reading steals time from real experience. I could be talking to you, but I am reading. Becoming its own experience. What is striking about, say, 2011 in particular as a year is that it probably will go down in history as the most documented year of people's uprisings, maybe even ever. Any project mediated too heavily will sink in a pond of spectatorship. To stand in a sit-in and ask, what should I do? The response is, just be there. Your presence matters. Participate, talk to people, understand. If you feel like doing something, document or not. Perhaps you know that someday you might take time to think about this and write it. The instant I personally admit to this. I know I'm a thief of collective experience. But then also I have a dream, in which a real dream that I had some time ago. And in this dream, I'm addressing a small group of people outside of a cinema, like in the back, so in the back of a cinema. And it's in a corner of a place that's definitely not Cairo, because we're speaking English. And I repeatedly call out, I don't believe in collectivism, I only believe in individuation. And of course I wake myself up because I'm quite loud in my own dream. And I'm both anxious and horrified. And in the dream, a small crowd around me sort of completely start harassing me with questions. But what about what's happening now? But what about what's happening now? And somehow I fail to respond. And it is about distinguishing individual experiences in a way. Because the political essentially is personal too. It's not just the other way around. It is bothersome that my dreams are somehow co-opted by these kind of isms, like collectivism of language. And voices raised against you even by yourself in dreams are provoking and isolating. In real experience, being amongst many, many people is one that makes you very, very conscious of being alone, separate. And when you replay the experience, you think and imagine this being together amidst millions, but sometimes it really doesn't feel like that at all. So you replay the experience to imagine feeling like that, to realize this feeling of being together. And this is also one of very many mind tricks. Work on it. It's nice. On violence. To write demands peace. To write on insurrection is to think of violence. I can't write on violence. And the problem with semantics is that they change based on lived experience. Granted, insurrection coming, insurrection going, to term protest as peaceful, as in peaceful protests, is irritating. Let's agree. The term is at odds with itself. We mean different things when we say certain things. And terms in language are strategies. Think about peaceful protest. There's nothing peaceful about protesting peacefully, in part because necessity has cast aside the coordinates of what is peaceful and what is not. And I will not approach an argument that predicates whether throwing back a tear gas canister is peaceful or not. It is peaceful. To violate the status quo is a peaceful act. To conclude, ask a simple question. I will read it slowly. Focus. What do sparrows, writers, insurgents, traders, and gamblers all have in common? I'll read it again. I'll give you a moment to think about it, and then I'll tell you. So what do sparrows, the bird, writers, insurgents, traders, like traders in the economy, gamblers, all have in common?
Maybe they communicate with each other.
They communicate.
If it would be not for parrots, I would say the sense of risk. About parrots and
They are.
They all tweet.
They
all tweet.
They all tweet. That's true. Gamblers too. Right. Tweeting gamblers. Sparrows. Yes. Chip, chip, chip. Risk.
You give us the answer, or make us.
I would love to say maybe you should come back tomorrow for the answer, but and then I can guarantee you'll be here. No. So, in fact, the answer to this has to do with risk, and so it is that they will all avoid risk unless they are faced with difficult energetic stress. So in fact, what happens is that in extreme cases, so for example, if a sparrow is risking like there's no food, or a writer is risking like having to write a text, an insurgent risking their life, a trader making a bad deal, and so on, is that they will all act precisely out of loss, over loss aversion, not over risk aversion. So risk is something that is taken, essentially, but it's kind of, you only act when things have become really, 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 really shitty, essentially. So I'll leave you on that note. Think about it, and maybe that's something good to talk about. All right, thank you very much.
Okay, what should we do now? Maybe there is a little bit of time left for those who wants to stay a few minutes longer. Perhaps we could talk a little bit. Perhaps you have some questions for Sarah, or Katya, or anybody else in this room.
Or to you.
Or to me, yes.
I just had a question, probably in general.
Take the microphone.
Yeah. I just had a question, probably in general.
I think maybe it's not turned on very good. Let's see.
I just had a question, probably a general question. There was told a lot about being present and the importance of being present. For example, if we speak about some protests. And I just wanted probably to discuss with someone what's the place of the act in it, of the action, or some spontaneous action. Because, as it was told, if we have some reasons, have some target in our action, it makes our action in some way involved in all this capitalistic idea of profit and all this, but still we need some way to act, and there is some desire to act in any person. And yeah, and in fact I wanted to ask about it, Franco, but probably you have some ideas about it. I just have no some real answer, but probably someone has some ideas about it, about the problem of action without target, but still target, sorry. Yeah. Okay.
Я спросил о роли действия, вот как мы говорим по поводу о важности пребывания в настоящем. Я спросил, какое место в этом занимает акт, потому что когда мы говорим акт действия, когда мы говорим даже про протест, все равно стоит вопрос о том, что люди хотят что-то совершать, что-то как-то действовать, но при этом идея того, что есть какая-то цель у этого, она часто оказывается репрессивной, в общем, что мы должны репрессивной, то есть мы должны достичь какого-то успеха, наш протест должен и так далее. То есть вот вопрос об этом. Сейчас.
Can I add something to your question that maybe might complicate it? It's not really. Oh, sorry. It's not really an answer to your question, but my new friend here, Vlad, raised the question when he arrived. He didn't know what this was, what was going on here, and he was very concerned. It seemed. So I'm throwing him in here. But he was very concerned about being here as opposed to being at Chisti Pudi, where there has been some occupation going on for the past it's another part of the city where there's been some occupation going on for the past week, and it's being forcibly disbanded now. So he wondered about, he didn't feel, should I be sitting here eating or being there? So to this question about act, I guess I would like to add another layer of thinking about act without target, but also doesn't matter where we are physically at any given time.
The question about where to be physically is, I think, one that I'm constantly also asking myself, in the sense that particularly with, so say for example, it has to do with labor, it has to do with, I can only be here because I can also be somewhere else on my phone working all the time. And so there's that kind of presence, or in relation to say, I'm assuming the same is here, that there's sort of this extremely compulsive relationship to social networking platforms like Twitter, like Facebook for organization and so on. The one thing, I think there was a moment at which I thought, okay, it's possible to, this extreme virtual mediation and this being somewhere else is kind of possible, but somehow there is this really interesting moment, and Bifo also speaks about this, which is, he has this term, what is it? He says we are the generation that has learned more words from the machine than from the mother. And this moment, say, of protesting politically for us now, it's interesting because it actually means you return to this idea of being a body and like somehow having to participate in this extremely slow activity that is tedious and boring as hell sometimes. Like the fact that you have to repeatedly go as a physical body and be present in a particular situation in order to act in this very open way, where it's not about a particular thing, but really just for, let's call it a good life. That's kind of what it comes down to. It's interesting, and I think I don't know, maybe I think the body is important. I mean, both in the sense of pleasure, but also in the sense of politics, and in our kind of consideration of that. But I also don't completely dismiss this, and I also feel that this gives me pleasure in a physical sense as well. I think it's important. But I don't know, these are just kind of also more ruminations than answers, I guess, to your question.
Your essay, which was really very interesting, so it's a real thing. I mean, it's not. It's a real thing. It's not a fantasy or. Okay. Okay. And then
the letter of the invisible committee, the real thing.
No, I mean the other facts from morgue, etc., etc. They are the real thing.
Yeah.
Okay. When I asked you a question the previous day about the social dispositions of the ongoings in Cairo, you told me that the formal answer cannot be given because the question was about involvement and the question was about the presence. But don't you think that at some point there should exist some kind of detached analysis which enable you to calculate pragmatically the situation and the future things? And don't you think that this presence within the event, if it's not then calculated and if it's not then analyzed, cannot bring you to the goal that you are envisaging? I'm saying because we all know that this wonderful excitement about rejecting the authoritarian power, which we also face right now. This moment is past, this moment is overcome, and then the depression comes. And then the depression comes because the question is who takes the power and who takes in charge. So probably now the period is about what comes next after the insurrecting ecstasis. Yeah.
There's sort of, like right now, like there's sort of constantly two camps. Some people are saying this is not the time for political parties and realpolitik. It's the time still for protest, occupation and action. And I think in a way this kind of reflects both sides of the, you need two hands, and they need to work together. They can't really work apart, meaning to say that what happened in terms of, for a very long time there was something that was completely turned off and that we were desensitized to, I think worldwide, like this possibility for acting in this extremely sincere and non-cynical, outside of the, a very sort of cynical postmodern stance on things, and actually just shutting away with all that and going back to the very basics of going bread, freedom, social justice, occupation, down to the streets, and being very literal about that. And that, of course, produces an immense feeling of euphoria, but it's not one or the other. But the problem is, I think I also have had to rethink my preferencing for the detachment and analysis, because I was simply, in a physical sense, proven also very wrong, just through the longevity of this experience. Like presumptions, I say, for example, things like self-organization in Egypt are not possible, or it would be impossible. If one were to objectively ask, Cairo is one of the dirtiest cities in the world. It is probably most polluted city in the world. To think that you can, for example, live together in a square for 20 days, and it being a hygienically okay situation is a bit like saying, I've met an alien last night. And somehow, I think trusting in experience also, just trusting in that process, I think is something that we don't do enough. And it's something where now I feel many things have turned back, or out of fear, we often turn back into allowing things to take place in this more detached realm of rhetorical negotiation. Things don't get solved. On the ground, they're solved. So it's something I think many of us feel very strange about.
When something happens in a remote zone, there are always the theorists who want to claim it from the point of view of their theory, because there are many theoreticians talking and writing about politics, and for instance, I told you, Hart and Negri were claiming that what happened in Egypt is a middle-class insurrection connected with the mature immaterial labor class, and coming to some kind of universal democratic values. While Badiou was claiming that this is the insurrection of the poorest layers of society, and this is some kind of proletarian. So for you, this doesn't work, So this seems quite artificial. Or what would you say? What would you answer to this kind of
it does. I mean, it has
illustrative?
I think it's figurative. It's fiction. Sorry, I keep reading. It's figurative, it's fiction, it's speculative, it's beautiful, it helps to think about things.
So all these things
but it's not anything, in fact, to state knowingly who was there and how this started is a total shot in the dark, because we were there. We did not know who would come. Nobody knew who would. And so this is the kind of, so to stand from a distance and be and this is the proletariat, and this is the bourgeois, and this is the education. in fact, it's also that these categories are in language also, because what does that mean? Like, how do you sort of sit and look at people around you and sleeping in a tent and categories?
We here can place it.
Yeah, I mean, you can place it in broad lines, but like, I think there's also certain overlaps. Like, I think also in terms of like Egypt, like when you look at, say, even linguistically at these various categories of class, they've also shifted in the last 30 years due to this particular economy. So like, there's a certain confusion of how we speak about these categories: worker, laborer, a farmer, and this, that. These things are totally co-opted, like in terms of how we think about them and in terms of how they work. It's also language maybe sometimes is a little bit behind in that sense. And I have no, I mean, I think the event is there for anybody, you know, like life is life in the sense that it inspires writing and thought, and they kind of inform each other in a way. And again, I think writing is thinking with words about things that are really happening, and I think if that helps us through reading Hart and Negri and possibly Badiou, then that's a good thing. I don't think there's any sort of territoriality to making a claim about a movement. But I think to completely, what was interesting is how the event arrived as this almost cathartic release maybe for many thinkers. That's a bit strange. But it's kind of nice that it's happening.
Did you get your question?
Huh?
Did you get your question answered? Can I ask a question about? Can I just ask a question? Maybe this is also for Anton about doing this here and in other cities. I mean, I've been in Moscow since October, and it seems very different to me from New York in terms of the way people relate to each other, and in terms of this issue of solidarity that Franco was talking about as a kind of aesthetic, you know, experience of, I don't know, kind of some kind of connection with the other. It feels very different for me here. So in doing this here, do you, I guess in what way do you, how do I put this? How is this project different here for you in terms of the planning and thinking it through than say in the other cities that you've done it? Does it change in any way, or is it kind of the same idea?
Well, the structure is the same. Of course, the way people react to it or the way people sort of engage with it is really different in different places. You know, of course, like we can't, you know, this project was started about a year ago before all of this started happening here, yeah? In the same way that when we did it in New York, when we were running the restaurant, suddenly the Occupy project happened in the middle of this project. You know, it's not like we can't, with this kind of things, it takes so long to develop them that sometimes they overlap with very, very major political events. Or for example, when we opened a branch of the bank in Holland, you know, initially it was invited just to be a part of a group exhibition, yeah? And then suddenly, as the exhibition opened, the Dutch government suddenly cut cultural funding by 50%. So suddenly the project went from being largely a figurative type representation to be included in an art exhibition into people involved with it suddenly realized, well, that could potentially be one of the viable ways in which they could continue their activity without state funding, without all of this kind of systems of support that were suddenly severed, yeah? So they took it completely seriously, and exhibition is over now a year ago, but this project there is continuing and growing, and yeah. So I think it's not that we try to sort of reshape it each time we do it somewhere else. Essentially, you know, it's not this idea of time banking or this kind of a time-based economy. It's not our idea. It's a rather old idea. It goes back to the 19th century and all of that. But I think that the context actually determines very much how much viability it has, how much it develops. For example, we also did it in Frankfurt, and Frankfurt is one city in Europe that is not going through economic crisis, because all of the banks are in Frankfurt, and basically all of the money of Europe is at the moment parked there, yeah, in these banks. Like all of the money that is missing in Greece is actually in Frankfurt. So it was quite interesting to do it. Yeah, the water is ready. the reaction there was, of course, or the kind of engagement with the project there was so different than what we saw in New York or what we saw in Holland. It was perceived much more as an exhibition, let's say, because there was not this kind of objective need for this kind of alternative economy in a city where there appears to be plenty of money. I don't know if it fully answers your question, but
no, it's good.
Something else. More questions?
I have a question to Sarah, which I was planning to ask in detail later, but still I cannot restrain myself from asking already now. So you presented a very beautiful piece of half documentary, half fiction, beautiful narrative inspired by political events. Is there anything like that in art? Are there artists who would do something similar in artistic field, something fictional or half fictional? Is there some step ahead in understanding this?
We started going back, actually. I started looking at it. Immediately when things started changing politically, there was this really weird moment in which many of us would start looking at work that had been produced several years back, and very intuitively, and it was terrible and embarrassing to admit it to each other, we started looking at these works and thinking they were clairvoyant. So you could almost start seeing, but it has something to do with, I guess, what maybe to tie it back to what Bifo was saying, that the past always changes depending on where you are in the present. So in fact, I mean, as none of us, at least on a conscious level, ever imagined this could happen politically, I think also, if like it's not an encoded mystical thing in the artwork, essentially that is secretly clairvoyant, but it's just the interpolation, how we interpret the artwork and how the artwork responds pertains to this very particular moment. And like very detailed conversations, I mean, about individual works of artists. And now I think like it would be difficult again to claim whether it would be difficult to say, okay, artists are making this specific thing or work that carries these specific characteristics or gestures or, you know, acknowledgement of a particular moment of change. I think inherently the work somehow already would or does if it's interesting in a sense, and if it's not extremely overt. So in a way I would say yes, but also I would say that it is not literal, and I still feel that the work has, or a lot of work that is being produced now, I mean, it's slowed down a lot, because people lost quite a bit of time in terms of production, say, and output, that's, or didn't lose time, but made time for other things. And yes, I think there is a trace of what is happening that is embedded within how artists make art, how writers write, how poets write, and so on, in a way that I think will start appearing more clearly in the months to come rather than like going back. I don't know if that directly answers your question. I would be hesitant to, yeah, I would be hesitant to single out a work or an artist because it's very art.
Yes.
I don't know, probably it's a private question. Okay, I just wanted to ask you, we read some tests for this, how to call it, Occupy in Moscow. And is it polite to ask you, probably I could ask some piece of your text? Yeah, okay, thank you. Okay.
So shall we stop for tonight, or shall we continue? Up to you guys. We can maybe continue tomorrow. Or
So how did you all find out about this?
About how did we get to know about it?
Yeah.
I from one from us from Rifky, and the second time I got this on Facebook.
Facebook. And do most of you know each other, just from appearance even, or not at all?
First time.
Well,
But some.
quite number of
Okay.
quite a number of people know each other.
I actually have a question.
Yeah.
Michael.
Hi, my name is Igor. I have a question regarding the technology of how you produce this project and how it all came up. You approached the gallery, or the gallery approached you, and is there any, well, the galleries usually capitalize the product, or in this case, is there any product to be consumed other than discussion?
because I want the answer to be recorded.
Please.
So I'll tell you exactly, to be totally transparent about this, how all of this came up here in Moscow in the States. First of all, this is not a commercial gallery, it's a foundation. I think it started many years ago as a gallery, but since then, the person who started it felt that it's more interesting for her to just run a not-for-profit space, only exhibit artists' work and not to bother with selling or enter this kind of business aspect of things, because partly that's also a lot of work, the business of art, yeah? And maybe there is much more pleasure in just showing something than trying to, yeah? But it was not exactly, what happened was we were invited to participate in Documenta, and Documenta is this gigantic exhibition that takes place in Germany, yeah? But Documenta apparently, despite the fact that they claim the biggest budget of any art exhibition in the world, had zero budget for artist projects. So when we asked them, well, what can we do? What is our budget? Well, they said, well, actually it's zero. And you have to find your own means of support, etc. Normally the way it works in the business of art is if you are a commercially viable gallery and if you're represented by a gallery that would then sell your work, they're happy to pay for your participation in something like Documenta. Yeah, because for that they know that they could immediately sell whatever you exhibited there. But with this kind of projects, we don't have a gallery, we don't work with commercial galleries. There's nothing to sell. Yeah. So for us, it was really a big dilemma. And then Boris Groys said that maybe I should talk to Nikolai because maybe Stella Art Foundation Moscow would be interested in supporting our project in Germany, in Kassel, at Documenta. And I proposed this to Nikolai, and he said that yes, this is interesting. And would you also like to present some of it here in Moscow? And I was born in Moscow, but I've never actually worked here as an artist before. So for me, that was also kind of a fantastic bonus. Yeah. So they're kind of sponsoring our participation in Documenta, and we're also doing this project here. Yeah. So this is like the total structure of why and how all of this is happening right now.
I also had a question regarding the lecture series. Actually, it seemed to me that the first person that should be invited here is Rifky who...
Yeah, he has been invited and he agreed to come, and then unfortunately Rifky is very, very, very ill. So we don't know if he will be able, he's in Berlin right now, basically undergoing a medical treatment. If he recovers and is strong enough, he may come at the closing of this project at the end of June. We hope that it will be possible, yeah.
And also, I thought that another person is missing from the list of guests,
yeah,
which is Clara Bishop. She wrote an excellent essays, some excellent essays regarding this kind of artistic projects.
Well, she kind of changed her mind a little bit. I noticed her referring to the October.
It would be a really interesting discussion, and an exchange of opinions.
You know,
critics.
We always invite there in New York, like when we have exhibitions and some kind of dinners or something like that. And you know, I completely disagree with everything she writes, but she's a delightful person.
With everything.
Yeah, that's the point. If you like.
But unfortunately, it's not an interesting kind of conversation to engage with her because, for me personally, I mean, maybe other artists that she kind of disagrees with. I know, I think Liane Gillick has, for years, has wanted to sort of engage with her publicly and tell her how completely wrong she is. For me, this kind of discourse is not, it's not particularly interesting. Yeah, if I know for sure that I completely disagree, and vice versa, it's not a productive
For me neither, actually also, but we know her very well.
But you know, she was in Moscow.
She does, and we already had these discussions and simply didn't want to repeat them.
Yeah, perhaps. But also, I have to say that she kind of changed a little bit her position over the years. It moved from kind of a complete dismissal of this kind of projects. Now she's trying to sort of say, well, some of them are better than others. Unfortunately, I completely disagree with the kind of judgments and criteria that she uses. It doesn't make any sense for me, yeah? But I see that she's trying to kind of get her head around kind of practices that she was just completely dismissive of, you know, 6, 7, 8 years ago. So she's changing as well, which is, I guess, normal, is it? Because people, you know, grow and develop and change their ideas over time.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Oh, and Rifky cooked with us in New York.
Yeah, Rifky actually did one of the opening dinners for this project we did in New York. He cooked, and it was actually an incredible afternoon because it's quite special to cook with him. He's quite, for one thing, he's become a very experienced chef, yeah, so the food is actually quite good, but also there is a kind of a strange energy that a lot of people who don't know each other suddenly start working so harmoniously together in a kind of a very intense situation that I've never quite experienced it before, where there is just a kind of a, I don't know, would you agree that that was quite unusual?
Yes, I completely agree.
Not really serving the food and not eating, but actually preparing it together in a very small kitchen. 12 strangers, some of whom knew each other, most of them didn't, because you really can step on each other's toes when you're cooking, and somehow, like, the way he doesn't really organize it, but it imposes a kind of a strange structure that makes...
And if something goes wrong, he just starts laughing. That's also quite
That's true, yeah. He doesn't get too stressed out.
Okay, I have a questions. Another interesting thing about this project is the time bank online. So people are members and they register and then they can post things and have some exchanges outside of the kitchen and eating part. Do you guys have a way of documenting, or do you plan to do anything with these kinds of exchanges? Like what happens? What kinds of things happen between people? So someone posts something. I posted something about a project I'm doing and someone responded immediately and we're gonna go do something on Saturday. Do you have a way of like, of keeping track of or collecting or documenting, or do you plan to do anything with that?
You know, no, actually the developer made a decision at the very beginning not to collect any kind of documentation or visual documentation, or just because we know how conceptual art tends to function. Yeah, like you kind of do things that are completely without an object, you never intend to sell it, and 20 years later somehow all of this documentation ends up in some gallery. You know, they become like extremely collectible objects, which is kind of what happened to much of conceptual art, in fact. You know, so we kind of, you know, for us this is the real sort of economy of this platform, and we don't want to get directly sort of involved, and also we don't want to collect this kind of information. And we do save the announcements or these listings because some of them are sometimes they're almost kind of like text poems or something, yeah, and it's actually quite interesting. But we don't really track exchanges or ask people to send us back visual material or anything like that.
Okay.
So maybe then we finish for today, and I hope some of you will come back tomorrow, because this is a bit of a marathon and it continues, and the food will be extremely good tomorrow, so come for lunch and hopefully talk. Bye.